There are survivor games that ask you to build, craft, and endure. Subnautica asks you to descend. It turns every dive into discovery, dread, and curiosity at the same time. What started as a small underwater experiment at Unknown Worlds Entertainment grew into one of the most beloved survival franchises ever made. The first game was built in public, tested in public, criticized in public, and shaped in public. Below Zero followed the same model but aimed for something different, a more direct story, a speaking protagonist, and a cast of characters, all while trying to keep the isolation that made the original work. Now, Subnautica 2 is pushing the series into a new era with a new planet, optional co-op, and a development story that is already part of the franchise itself. Before Subnautica, Unknown Worlds had already spent years on something bigger, louder, and far more demanding. Natural Selection 2. It took years to build, relied on a custom engine, and arrived as a serious multiplayer shooter built around weapons, combat, and competition. After that experience, Charlie Cleveland and the team wanted the next game to be smaller, safer, and very different in tone. By 2013, the team was looking for a new direction. The space game market was crowded, and they did not want to try to outmuscle bigger studios, so they chose the ocean. Unknown Worlds wanted a setting where it could compete by doing something almost nobody else was doing, and that idea became Subnautica. That decision shaped everything that followed. Subnautica was never meant to be a risking survival game. From the start, the goal was the atmosphere first, exploration first, and fear through the environment rather than through combat. The team wanted the player to feel calm 1 minute and hunted the next, without leaning on the usual genre tools. The earliest version of Subnautica was rough in the best possible way. The first prototype was less a game than a mood experiment. The team played with music and atmosphere before much of anything else existed, trying to capture the feeling of being underwater before they build a full structure around it. From there, the team built out a series of prototypes. One version was closer to a shore diving experience, another focused on a single biome and a simple objective, just enough to test the movement, oxygen, and the basic logic of surviving below the surface. Modular submarines, co-op ideas, and a starter vehicle all showed up early, but many of those concepts did not last. That was not failure, it was the process. The team discovered that some ideas were clever on paper but awkward in play. A modular submarine that needed multiple people sounded ambitious, but in practice it made the game clunky. Even the starter submarine gave way to something more stable, a fixed base and a clear survival loop. Instead of forcing the player down one vehicle path, the game gave them a place to return to, then let the ocean become the thing they had to master. Another early decision changed everything. Guns were removed. Unknown Worlds had spent years making a shooter, and Subnautica was meant to move in the opposite direction. Danger will come from wildlife, pressure, darkness, and isolation. If the player could not fight the ocean, then they will have to understand it. In April 2014, Subnautica was shown publicly at PAX East for the first time. The demo was tiny compared with the final game, but it did exactly what it needed to do. It proved the idea worked, it proved underwater exploration could stand on its own, and it proved the atmosphere had real power even in an early incomplete build. At that stage, one of the most important decisions was the move from procedural generation to handcrafted world design. The team had considered the procedural approach, but the demo showed that players responded more strongly to memorable spaces, strong silhouettes, and a place that feels designed rather than random. The world became handcrafted and that choice defined Subnautica identity. It also changed the team itself. Unknown worlds grew because handcrafted worlds need artists, level designer and tool makers. The game stopped feeling like a technical experiment and started looking like a real production. The reaction to the demo mattered for another reason. Players were already afraid of the ocean, even innovation where almost nothing could hurt them. The dark water was enough. The team realized it did not need to invent fear. The setting already had it. The public reaction to that first demo was also important for another reason. Players were scared of the ocean. Subnautica first public sale came through Unknown World's own website in October 2014 under the name Earliest Access. This was before Steam Early Access and it was more than a preview. It was a way for the studio to survive. The company was under real financial pressure. Development had expanded beyond the original plan. The team had grown and the costs were rising faster than expected. Selling access directly gave Unknown World a chance to keep going, but it also gave them something else, feedback at scale. That feedback loop became one of the franchise defining traits. Player could report back from inside the game. Unknown Worlds could see where they got stuck, what they liked, and what they tried to do. The Aurora, for example, was originally meant to sit in the background, but players keep swimming toward it because that is what players do when they see a mysterious ship on the horizon. The studio listened and the Aurora became one of the most important locations in the game. A few weeks later, on December 16, 2014, Subnautica was entered Steam Early Access. That moment changed everything. That transparency also shaped the game culture. Players were not just buying a survival game, they were watching one being built. They saw bugs, reports turned into fixes, concept art become real location, and experimental systems come and go. Because the process was visible, the eventual success of Subnautica felt earned rather than lucky. The community quickly learned that Unknown World would change direction when the evidence pointed that way. Procedural worlds were dropped. The original idea of purely floating exploration path gave way to handcrafted spaces and fixed landmarks. Even the Aurora changed, going from a distant backdrop to a place the player could actually reach. As a result, the game emotional center shifted. Fear, mystery, and progression all had to work together if the ocean was going to hold attention for dozens of hours. Once the game hit Steam, it stopped being a rescue experiment and became a living public project. The studio used public task boards, frequent dev updates, open bug reporting, and live build to let players see development in progress. It was messy, but it was honest, and that honesty mattered. The early Steam build was tiny, but the strategy was starting to work. What kept Subnautica alive was not one feature, it was the way the features started to support each other. The Cyclops arrived in early 2015 and turned the ocean into a place the player could travel through more safely and dramatically. Soon after came the first real sea bases, giving players a permanent home. The Habitat update expanded that idea with larger rooms, connectors, observatories, bulkheads, and proper power systems. The sea mode followed and gave the player a faster personal vehicle. The moon pool and upgrade system gave that vehicle a home. These updates did more than add toys. They taught the player how Subnautica works. Vehicles need docking, docking need bases, bases need power, and power needed a reason to matter. Each update expanded the loop without breaking that feeling that the player was stealing alone against the huge and uncaring environment. By this stage, the update had a clear read. Unknown worlds would identify a major feature, build a smaller supporting update around it, and then explain the change openly to the community. That kept the game feeling alive in a way few survival projects ever do. The devs were not just balancing mechanics, they were negotiating the identity of the game in public. Suddenly, the game had a rhythm: dive, gather, return, build, and go deeper. At the same time, the team was still learning what the game was really about. At first, the core loop was survival and crafting, but the structure still lacked a strong narrative purpose. Players wanted more than a sandbox, they wanted a reason to keep descending. So the studio hired a writer and started building a story around the planet, the alien technology, and the mystery beneath the surface. This was the point where Subnautica stopped being a game about surviving underwater and became a game about finding out why the ocean was the way it was. The early access version of Subnautica grew step by step through a long chain of updates. By the middle of 2015, it was already becoming much more complete. Base building matured, vehicle support improved, the Aurora became explorable instead of just visible, radiation became a real threat around the crash site, and players finally had a reason to go inside the ship that brought them there. That matter because the Aurora is one of the clearest example of a player-driven development in the project. That matters because the Aurora is one of the clearest example of player-driven development in the project. Players keep trying to reach it. The team responded by making it real, then turning it into a dangerous and story-critical location. That kind of change only happens when a studio watches the community closely and treats feedback as a design data. Subnautica development was also unusual because the studio released the frequent updates instead of waiting for giant milestone drops. Every few weeks the game changed. Sometimes the changes were small, sometimes they introduced major systems. Either way, the world kept getting deeper and the player kept getting more tools to survive it. As the game grew, more familiar pieces fell into place: the scanner, the repair tools, the status rifle, vehicle upgrades, and more base components. The sea base stopped being a placeholder and became a real home. The player was no longer just a lone swimmer in a pretty ocean. They were building a future under pressure. Subnautica worked so well because it replaced combat with fear. The first time the Cyclops appeared, it was not just a vehicle, it was a promise that the world could keep getting bigger. Later, the developers introduced larger and more threatening creatures to make the ocean feel alive and dangerous. The Reefback was one of the first giant life force player encountered, and even though it was harmless, its scale made people uneasy. The Reaper Leviathan did the opposite. It gave the game a real apex predator, a creature that made sound itself feel like a warning. The world was not built around enemy to kill. It was built around organisms to avoid, study, and respect. Some creatures were peaceful, some were territorial, some were so massive that their presence changed the mood of the entire biome. That was also when the game identity became clear to players and streamers. People did not just want to survive in Subnautica, they wanted to find out what was out there, then panic when they got too close. The fear was not shallow, it came from distance, from the unknown, and from the sense that the ocean had more layers than player could safely handle. The studio understood that instinctively. It kept leaning into a skill of the world, the sound design, and the feeling that every major journey was a little more dangerous than the last. At first, Subnautica's story was minimal: survive, explore, get out. But the deeper the game went, the more the narrative had to grow. The final story that players know centers on Riley Robinson, the Aurora, and the planet 4546b. The ship official mention was to build a phase gate, but it also involved finding the missing Legacy crew. When the Aurora arrived in orbit, It was shut down by a quarantine enforcement platform and crashed into the ocean. Riley escapes in a lifeboat and becomes the lone survivor, trying to understand why this planet is so hostile. That story matters because it gives shape to the survival loop. The player is not gathering materials for the sake of it. They are trying to understand the fate of the ship, the fate of the missing crew, and the reason the planet is sealed off from the rest of the galaxy. The story also gave the game a stronger sense of place. The Legacy crew proved that others had already come here and tried to survive. Their bases become signs of ambition and failure. The precursor facilities hinted at a civilization far older and more advanced than humanity. The quarantine platform explained why escape was impossible at first, and the Aurora with its hidden mission and the wreck hull turned the opening disaster into a much bigger question. Why was this planet important enough for someone to build a wall around it? One of the most important details in the story is not told in a straight line. It is discovered in layers. The player first hears radio signals and sees strange structures. Later, still they reach the Lost River, the lava zones, and the final alien facility. That slow layering is a huge part of why Subnautica works. Every deeper area answers one question and creates two more. As the game expands, the mystery gets bigger. Riley finds the Legacy bases and learns what happened to the earliest survivors. He learns about the precursor civilization, the Carabacterium, and the quarantine system built to contain it. He realized the planet is not empty at all. It is a world shaped by all science, all disasters, and choices made long before he arrived. The key design choice here is that the story never interrupts the game, it grows out of it. The depth progression matters, the radio messages matter, the infection matters because the deeper you go, the more the world changes around you. Story and mechanics support each other all the way down. By 2016, Subnautica had moved far away beyond its early shape. One update brought a large graphical overhaul. Another added the scanner and PDA database in a more complete form. Later update introduced the Prawn Suite, the Sea Dragon Leviathan, the Lost River, and eventually the deepest volcanic region of the map. The names of some of these updates become part of the community memory. Cyclops, Habitat, Seamood, Dangerous Creatures, Bones, and others. Each one added a new piece to the structure. Some updates were about vehicle, some were about world density, some were about making the ocean deeper and stranger. Some were about finishing the story that had slowly been assembled over time. The late game additions are especially important because they turn the final descent into something dramatic. The disease research facility, the containment facility, the Sea Emperor Leviathan, and the cure for Kara tied the ecology, alien history, and ending together. The player was no longer just surviving, they were uncovering the last answers the planet had to give. Not everything planned for Subnautica survived the journey. Multiplayer terraforming, some weather systems, and colonization ideas were all cut or left behind. The late middle of Subnautica's development is where the scale really snapped into focus. The early 2016 graphical algorithm made the game feel less like a promising prototype and more like a world. The Prawn Suite added a new way to descend into harsh terrain. The Sea Dragon Leviathan made the lava regions feel truly hostile. The Lost River turned the deepest cave system into airy beauty rather than just a corridor. And by the time the game introduced the lava castle, the precursor base, the disease research facility, and the Sea Emperor, the final stretch of the story was locked in. These were not random additions, They were part of a deliberate push to connect progression to environmental escalation. The deeper the player went, the more the game revealed about the infection, the old alien empire, and the choices that left the planet quarantined. The final cure of Kara did not come from a combat victory or a scripted escape. It came from understanding another species and learning to work with it. That is part of what made the final game so focused. It was not trying to do everything, it was trying to do a few things extremely well. If Subnautica had been developed in secret, it might still have been a good game, but it would not have been this game. The open development process gave unknown worlds an unusual amount of live feedback. Players told the team what they liked, what they hated, what scared them, and where they were trying to go even when the game clearly told them not to. The Aurora became explorable because people wanted to get it. Base building grew because players wanted a safe place to return to. The story grew because people kept asking what all this diving was for. Content creators gave the game a huge boost. Subnautica was the kind of game that made great video because it produced real reactions. The fear was authentic, the discoveries were visible, the tension was easy to understand. The exposure helped the game spread far beyond the core survival audience. There were still delays and uncertainty along the way. By late 2017, the team had expected a release in October, but the studio announced that January 2018 was more realistic. That delay was not a scandal, it was a sign that the team was being cautious and refusing to lock a date it could not hit. That attitude mattered. By then, Subnautica has spent years proving that the community would reward honesty. Players had been part of the process for so long that the release felt less like a launch and more like the end of a shared project. The full release completed the story, gave the game its final shape, and confirmed what the community had suspected for years. This was not just a clever indie survival game, it was one of the genre-defining titles. The game earned strong reviews, won major awards, and became a lasting success across PC and consoles. What mattered most was not just the score it received, it was the way the game had earned trust. Players watched it grow from a tiny prototype into a polished experience. They saw features come and go, and they watched the world deepen around them. Because of that, the final product felt owned as much by the community as by the studio. Subnautica's success proved that survival games did not need guns, PvP, or constant action to hold attention. It could work through tension, atmosphere, and discovery. It could make the ocean itself feel like a story. That lesson will matter again very soon. Below Zero was first revealed as the next chapter in the Subnautica universe, and at first it looked like a direct continuation of the original idea. More ocean, more mystery, more alien life. But from the start the project also wanted to do something different. The setting was Sector Zero, a frozen region of planet 4546b, where the players will deal with ice, storms, land travel, and colder waters. That frozen setting changed the series in a practical way. Water alone was no longer enough. Players had to move across snow, hidden cave entrance, glacial terrain, and open ice fields. That changed the pacing completely. The game could slow down, then force a sudden sprint across exposed land. It could make a creature feel dangerous, not because it was huge, but because the player had nowhere easy to hide from it. The Arctic creatures were part of the ship. Penguins made the surface. Sea monkeys gave the world a mischievous, almost social energy. Titan Hallfish created one of the strangest mutualistic designs in the series. Glow whales made the upper waters feel calm and ancient, and the ice war made the ground itself feel unstable. Below Zero was always more than a golden version of the original. The game will still be about survival and exploration, but the environment will no longer be the open tropical sea players knew from the first game. It will be harsher, more varied, and more vertical in a way it forced movement between water and land. Early impressions of Below Zero made one thing clear right away. The team was trying to expand the formula, not just repeat it. The new world introduced Arctic creatures, floating ice, polar forest, and land-based navigation. It felt like a real ecosystem, not a simple reskin. Below Zero entered early access on January 30, 2019. At that point, the game was still closer to an ambitious experiment than a finished sequel. It had a voice protagonist, a more direct story, and a stronger focus on the characters. The goal was to make the narrative more active and more personal than in the original Subnautica. That was a risky move. One of the strengths of first game had been its quietness. The player was mostly alone, and the world told its story through environments, logs, and discoveries. Below Zero wanted to tell a more traditional story on top of that structure, and not all of it came together cleanly at first. Still, the early access launch got the basic right. It gave players a new region to explore, a fresh biome palette, and a different tone. It also showed that Unknown World was not interested in just repeating the first game. The studio wanted the sequel to feel like a new angle on the same universe. By late 2019 and into 2020, the team had become open about something important. The story was not working as well as it needed to do. Unknown World said that the initial attempt at a living story with a speaking protagonist and an active characters had become messy. The motivation were not clear enough. The relationships were not landing properly. The game world existed, the mechanics existed, and the characters existed, but they were not working in harmony. That led to a major turn. Narrative designer Jill Murray joined the team and the story was rebuilt. Tom Juber, who had worked on much of the earlier fiction, left the project and the team made difficult call to rework the narrative structure. This mattered because it changed the identity of Below Zero. The game did not just get a new ending or few dialogue rewrites, it got a new center of gravity. The rewrite was also a sign that the studio was willing to protect the long-term health of the project rather than defend the first version out of pride. Jill Murray's new structure gave the story a clearer emotional spine. Robin's search for the truth about Sam gave the player a personal reason to be there. Alan's presence added a second thread that pulled the story toward the larger alien mystery. Marguerite kept continuity with the old world of 45-46B instead of scattered set of plot ideas. Below Zero became a story about grief, investigation, survival, and the uneasy possibility that player might not want to go home when the truth was finally uncovered. That change also altered the tone of the whole game. The original Subnautica had been about isolation and ambiguity. Below Zero became more talkative, more guided, and more character driven. Some players preferred one approach over the other, but the important thing is that the sequel did not ignore the debate, it answered it by changing course. The final version focused on Robin Ayu, a xenologist returning to 45-46B to investigate the death of her sister Sam. Along the way, she uncovers Altera, continued interest in Kara, meets the architect Alan, helps build him a body, and eventually become tied to a larger pet that the points beyond the planet itself. The rewrite also kept what players were responding the most. Marguerite Maida remained important, Alan remained important, the world stayed intact, but the story became more focused and more readable. The studio made a rare and very public decision to step back, admit that the story needed to work and rebuild it. Below Zero final early access update was called Seaworthy. By that stage the game had been cleaned up, polished and pushed into a more complete state. Steam Cloud support arrived, controller support improved, and the final pieces of the release plan came together. The studio announced that the full game will launch on May 14, 2021. It was moving to Steam, Epic and console platforms at the same time, including PlayStation, Xbox and Nintendo Switch. The sequel had grown into a full cross-platform release, which showed how much larger the franchise had become. The final run to launch was also notable for how calm the studio tried to be after the story rewrite. Unknown World had learned from the first game that the audience valued openness. So instead of pretending everything had always been perfect, the team explained what had changed and why. That honestly did not erase criticism, but it did help players understand the direction of the project. Subnautica Below Zero launched on May 14, 2021. At release, the game brought the end of Robin's story, the completion of Ellen's path home, and the final version of Outer Sector Zone storyline. Robin cures the frozen Leviathan, discovers what happened to Sam, and helps Ellen leave the planet. In lore terms, the game expands the universe without breaking away from the original planet history. It also shown that Altera is still willing to exploit the aftermath of Kara crisis for research. The reaction was mixed in exactly the way you would expect from a sequel to a beloved game. Players praised the visual design, the creatures, the expanded land section, and the stronger character work in some areas. At the same time, others felt that the game had less of the raw mystery and loneliness that made the first Subnautica so powerful. Both views can be true. Below Zero was not trying to be the first game again. It was trying to prove that the Subnautica universe could support a different kind of a story. In that sense, it succeeded. It also gave the franchise a more human voice, literally and structurally, which will matter later when the game began to take shape. Below Zero proved that Subnautica could evolve without losing its identity completely. It showed that the series could support more direct storytelling, more character interaction, a more land-based traversal. It also showed that limits of that approach. The team had to rewrite part of the game because the first version did not feel right, because it showed that even a successful studio with a hit franchise still had to listen when the structure was not working. More broadly, Below Zero turned the series from a one-off success into an actual franchise. The world of 45-46B became bigger. The lore around Kara, the arcs Altera and the old alien structures become more established, and the studio had now proven that it could return to Subnautica after the first game and still find something worth saying. In October 2021, Krafton acquired Unknown Worlds. That changed the business side of the franchise immediately. Even if the studio continued to operate with a degree of independence, from that point on, Subnautica was no longer just an indie success story. It was part of a larger corporate structure, and that structure will become very important when the next game entered development. For a while, the franchise stayed relatively quiet in public. Single player first, no battle pass, no subscription, no forced service design. On October 17, 2024, Unknown World showed the first teaser trailer for Subnautica 2 and announced that the game was heading to early access in 2025. That reveal did three important things at once. First, it confirmed that the series was moving to a brand new alien planet instead of returning to 45-46b. Second, it confirmed that co-op will be present with optional multiplayer support for players who wanted. And third, it told the audience that the game was being built from the start with early access in mind, just like the original Subnautica had been. The teaser created immediate excitement, but it also created a new kind of pressure. The teaser also did something Subnautica fans are good at responding to. It gave them just enough information to build theories. A new planet means a new ecosystem, but it also means new questions. Why is this world here? Who was here before the player? What does this planet have to do with the larger universe that already includes Altera, the architects and the Kara legacy from the first two games? Unknown Worlds did not answer this question in the reveal, and that silence was intentional. Mystery has always been part of the reward. The first public look also came with a promise that the studio had learned from the original game. Players will not be forced into a live service economy. There will be no battle pass, no subscription, and no loot box system hidden behind the ocean floor. The game will be built the way the series had always been built, in stages through updates, with players helping determine what survived and what changed. Now fans were not just waiting for the next game, they were trying to understand how much of Subnautica will still be there once the series expanded into a bigger multiplayer capable sequel. Unknown Worlds kept fading that anticipation with devlogs and small previews slowly building toward launch. In July 2025, Unknown Worlds announced that Subnautica 2 early access release will move from 2025 to 2026. The official explanation was that early playtests had gone well, but the team wanted more time to improve the game before launch. The studio said players were not responding positively to the environment, creatures and story. But also that some areas need more work. The delay will give the team time to add more biomes, more vehicle upgrades, additional tours, more story, and more creatures before the first public release. On paper, that was a normal development delay. In practice, it became the beginning of one of the biggest public controversies in the franchise history. The reason was simple. This was not happening in a vacuum. The game had been expected in 2025. A large bonus structure was reportedly tied to its success, and soon after the delay, Krafton removed Unknown Worlds co-founder and CEO from the studio. On July 2nd, 2025, Krafton announced that Steve Popotis will become the new CEO of Unknown Worlds. At the same time, the company removed Ted Gill, Charlie Cleveland, and Max McGuire from their roles. The move shocked a lot of fans because these were the people most closely associated with the Subnautica creation. It also happened just months before the sequel was supposed to reach early access. Unknown Worlds responded with a community letter that tried to reassure players. The team said the day-to-day developers on Subnautica 2 had not changed, that the vision of the game remained intact and the project was still committed to being a single-player first experience with optional co-op. The studio also said that the new leadership will not change the core structure of the game. But the public story did not end there. Legal feelings followed. So the reporting that Krafton leadership had used ChatGPT while trying to plan how to avoid paying the earnout tied to the studio acquisition. Krafton disputed the claims, but the story spread fast because it sounded like the kind of corporate drama that no one would have believed if it had been fiction. Then, in March 2026, a Delaware court ruled against Krafton. The judge ordered Ted Gill reinstated with operational control and found that Krafton had improperly seized the studio. That ruling did not magically erase the conflict, but it did restore the original leadership to the release process and made it clear that the dispute had real legal consequences, not just internet noise. By the time Subnautica 2 entered its final launch stretch in May 2026, the game development story had become almost as famous as the game itself. Unknown Worlds held a pre-launch showcase on May 9. The studio revealed that the gameplay trailer, open preload and pre-purchase, and reminded players that the game will launch into early access on May 40 for $30. The marketing emphasized that the game could be played solo or with up to 3 friends, and that player feedback will remain central through in-game tools and community channels. That was important because it brought the franchise full circle. The original Subnautica had survived by being built in public. Below Zero had grown by listening when the story did not work, and Subnautica 2 was being launched with the same promise. Play it, test it, tell us what you think, and help shape what comes next. The game itself arrives on an all new alien planet with a new ecosystem, new tools, new vehicles, and a new structure for exploration. By the time of the launch, the public conversation around Subnautica 2 had become about more than just the game. It had become about ownership, control, and what happens when a beloved studio is folded into a larger publisher business. And what happens when a beloved studio is folded into a larger publisher business plan. For fans, that made the launch feel like a relief and a test at the same time. The game had finally arrived, but it had arrived after a dispute that made many people pay closer attention to who was telling it. The launch itself leaned hard into strengths the series had always had. The trailer and showcase emphasized mood, exploration, and the feeling of dropping into a brand new world with a very little certainty. The roadmap promised regular updates, community feedback, and a slower build toward 1.0. That is exactly the kind of promise Subnautica players know how to understand because it is the same promise the original game made years ago. The world will grow if you keep coming back. Unknown Worlds has described the first early access roadmap as a series of smaller updates, followed by larger expansion that will grow the world, the story, and the mechanical system over time. In other words, the franchise is back where it started, at the beginning of a long public journey. Subnautica 2 is not just a sequel, it is a test, and it has to prove that a franchise known for open development can still make that process work when the stakes are much higher than they were in 2014. The strange thing is that all of the franchise's biggest strengths are also the things that made its history so complicated. What makes the series unusual is that each installment taught the next one something new. The first game learned that players would accept fear without combat if the world was interesting enough. Below Zero learned that a Subnautica game could carry spoken characters and more direct narrative, but only if the story was rebuilt when it stopped working. Subnautica 2 is now learning how to be both a sequel and a public process while also carrying the weight of corporate conflict that most indie origin franchises never have to face. That is why the history of Subnautica matters beyond the game themselves. It is a case study in how a studio can use transparency as both a design tool and a survival tool. The same openness that saved the first game from financial collapse helped the franchise build trust. The same openness that exposed the weak spots in Below Zero helped them to fix the story. And the same openness now surrounds Subnautica 2 as it launched into early access with a larger audience and a bigger spotlight and a much louder set of expectations that the series ever had before. Subnautica succeeded because it was open. Below Zero stumbled and recovered because it was open. Subnautica 2 has already been shaped by an unusually public series of delays, leadership changes, and legal disputes. That same openness can be painful, but it also means that series keep its most important quality intact. The player can see the process. The history of Subnautica is not just the history of 3 games. It is the story of a studio learning how to build something new without relying on the old formulas that had already worked for it. It is the story of a survival game that became scarier, stranger, and more beloved because the devs let the audience help shape it. Is it the story of a sequel that tried to speak more directly, then had to stop and rethink itself? And it is the story of a franchise moving into a new era while still carrying the weight of everything that came before. The first Subnautica gave players a silent ocean and asked them to survive it. Below Zero gave a cold world and asked them to understand it. Subnautica 2 is giving them a new planet and asking them to step into the unknown again, this time with more company, more scrutiny, and much larger spotlight. And somehow that still feels like the same series. If you step back far enough, the entire franchise follows a very clear pattern. Subnautica starts with a company trying to escape the problem of its past. Below Zero starts with a team trying to prove it can tell a new kind of a story inside the same universe. Subnautica 2 starts with that same team, now under much more public pressure, trying to prove that the series can still evolve without losing the thing that made people care in the first place. That is the real history here, not just a list of release dates, but a chain of design choices, public reaction, financial pressure, and course correction that keep the series moving. There is also a broader reason the games have lasted this long. They make the curiosity feel more important than conquest. You do not win Subnautica by overpowering the world. You win by understanding it well enough to survive it. That was true in the original game, it was true in Below Zero, and is still the core promise behind Subnautica 2. That promise is what made the first game special. A studio that had spent years making action-heavy multiplayer projects decided to make something quieter, stranger, and more personal. Then the studio let the audience watch it happen. Players helped turn a distant ship into a real crash site. They push for bases, vehicles, and deeper systems. They force the game to become more than a pretty prototype. Below Zero carried the same openness into a different kind of sequel. When the story was not working, Unknown Worlds did not hide it. The team stopped, changed writers, and rebuilt the narrative around clear motivation and stronger emotional center. That choice is one of the main reasons the game exists in a finished form at all. Subnautica 2 now carries the same philosophy into a much harder environment. It has had to launch under a spotlight, under legal pressure, and under the expectation that come with being one of the most watched survival game in years. But the same pattern is still there, a new world, a growing roadmap, and the studio asking players to help shape the game as it evolves. That is why the franchise still matters. The ocean in Subnautica is not just a backdrop. It's a system, it remembers what you do, it punishes carelessness, it rewards patience, and it turns every descent into a lesson. The original game taught players that fear could be beautiful. Below Zero showed that cities could change tone without losing its identity. Subnautica 2 is now testing whether that identity can survive a bigger world, a louder launch, and a more complicated business behind the scenes. Whatever happens next, the history is already clear enough to tell. Subnautica began as a risky idea from a studio trying to escape its past. It survived because others listened when players swam toward the Aurora, when they asked for bases, when they wanted deeper answers, and when the story needed to be rebuilt. Below Zero survived because the team was willing to admit when its first version was not enough. And Subnautica 2 arrives, carrying all of that history with it, along with the hope that the next great dive can still feel as strange and unforgettable as the first. In the end, every descent is also beginning. In Subnautica, that has always been the point. Drop a like if you liked the video, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.